Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Thursday seminar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose lands we meet today. Pay our respect to elders past and present. So today it is my pleasure to introduce Ulrich Faul, who is visiting us from MIT and doing some experiments in the lab downstairs whilst he's here. So Uli has a background of being through many different places. He started doing physics degrees, bachelor's and master's in Germany, master's from the University of Stuttgart. He then moved to the US for his PhD at the University of Oregon. And then he came here for a postdoc, first for a postdoc, and then as a research fellow from 1995 to 2006. So that would have been over a decade here at RSES. Then he moved back to the US. He was an associate professor at Boston University until 2013. After that time, he moved to MIT, where he is a research scientist. He also has a teaching position as an associate professor at Vassar College in New York, as well as a visiting scientist at the State University of New York at New Paltz in New York. Lily's research bridges many different aspects of geophysics, petrology, mineral physics, and very much interested in the mantle. He links microstructural and melting characteristics of mantle rocks to observable geophysics observables, properties such as seismic velocity and attenuation. Much of his influential work has been based on experiments done here at ANU, collaborating a long-term collaborator with Ian Jackson. And some of the work that they've done together has really been pioneering in these sort of mantle experimental, high temperature, high pressure work, and really has, as a seismologist, fundamentally changed the way that we interpret seismic observables of the Earth's interior, particularly in terms of seismology, physical properties such as velocity and attenuation. So today we're very much have the pleasure of hearing about the lower mantle this time instead of the upper mantle. So I look forward to hearing more. When you're ready.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be here. I should have put on the list of collaborators, of course, also Ian Jackson. I mean, the work comes up implicitly, but of course, extrapolated wildly to the lower mantle. And also Hitank, of course, who is doing his PhD currently. I will show some of his work as well. So hopefully the title will become clear as I go over the talk. From microns to thousands of kilometers. The experiments that we do in the lab, they're always, well, the grains, what we're looking at, the structures that we're looking at are the micron scale. And then, of course, we apply it to, extrapolation to the mantle, in this case, the lower mantle, right? So we have to think about how that looks like when we extrapolate our short time scale, very small experiments to the vast time scales of the mantle. So the main part of the work, the grain growth experiments, were done in the Bayerisches Geo-Institut in Germany with Tomo Katsura in principle. And then also later, the modeling that I'll show is done with a number of people here listed here. So first, a little bit of a background. I'll try to break the talk into separate compartments so you can follow along. Background, just as by way of introduction, structure of the upper mantle. In particular, for this talk, what is interesting in the upper mantle, right, you have the mineral olivine with a particular structure, chemical composition. Then you go through the transition zone, 400 to 660 kilometers. And in the lower mantle, in comparison to what you have in the upper mantle, things look a lot more simple, right? In principle, you only have two different phases, ferropericlase and magnesium silicate perovskite, or bridgemanite, as it's called. And then, okay, you link this calcium silicate perovskite together with a perovskite structure. So, here, what is shown is more the depth, right? The transition zone, or the transition zone finishes at 660 kilometers down to 1,000 kilometers. Here you can see they labeled at 700. It's more precisely 660, but down to almost 2,900 kilometers. That is the lower mantle. And that's what I'll be talking about, processes and properties of the lower mantle. And yeah, the minerals are listed here. Again, of course, there's always iron and then also other elements in there. but the principal components, which I will come back to, are these two. And yeah, another important part is the phase transition is at 25 gigapascals. So I'll come back to that. So the upper mantle in comparison, the lower mantle in comparison to the upper mantle was supposed to be kind of boring. Like, so it was known that there is what is called a degree 2 heterogeneity. Even in the 80s, I think, I didn't dig out all the papers there. Essentially, the structure is shown here in a section at depth. You have two, what I call, I'll refer to that later, large low shear velocity provinces, right? So you have these two here, one beneath Southern Africa, the other one in the Pacific. If you look at that in this cross section here, right, there isn't much happening. So here's the 660, 670 kilometer depth contour label. So that degree heterogeneity comes from what I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about. One way to look at the lower mantle is by looking at Earth's normal modes. So I'll introduce normal modes a little bit as well. So this was known, but then not much else there were no other images of the lower mantle. So just setting the stage a little bit, of course, I'll work mostly on the upper mantle. Of course, all the experiments that we do here are on the upper mantle. I really like these kind of rocks, right? That's a nice peridotite. It's a xenolith, so it's brought up in a volcanic eruption. Essentially, the basalt has some dissolved gas, so as it ascends through the lithosphere, it rips out pieces of the conduit. And that's how we know a lot about Earth's upper mantle, right? The relevant part here is that you have that rock, the peridotite, which is composed of different minerals, olivine, pyroxenes, and spinel, and so on. And therefore, it has not only grain boundaries between different olivine grains, right, the pale green stuff here, it also has phase boundaries between olivine and pyroxene. That's probably glycopyroxene here. So the key part of this is that the grain size of a rock determines a number of properties. And I just list one important one here, the viscosity, if the rock deforms by diffusion creep, but also seismic properties, which is, of course, what we measure in the lab here. So seismic properties are grain size dependent, viscosity is grain size dependent. So we need to know, since it's grain size dependent, we need to know the grain sizes of rocks in the Earth. And this is the background to the whole story. So here's demonstrated in a numerical model that was published in 2017 as part of a CIDR paper. So if you have an ascending plume, right, and so here's a cross-section through the mantle. This line here, the blue line, is the 660 kilometer discontinuity. If you have a constant grain size, the plume just goes straight through from the lower mantle transition zone into the upper mantle and then pancakes beneath the lithosphere. If the grain size evolves as a function of time, driven, as I'll show later, by surface energy reduction, so if the grain size evolves, then that structure of the ascending plume looks quite different. The plume no longer rises straight through the transition zone, but becomes bent and sheared. And these are just two different models with different grain growth rates. That paper in 2017 really set the stage because we realized at that time that very little was known about grain growth in the lower mantle. So that's why we started the experimental campaign, right? So we have different grain growth rates here, but really there wasn't much known about grain growth rates in the lower mantle. So the important part also from a geochemical perspective is if you have very different viscosities in upper and lower mantle, very different grain sizes, then you can effectively decouple upper and lower mantle, right? So this is the question of whole mantle versus layered convection. How decoupled is the lower mantle from the upper mantle? But I won't go into the geochemical arguments here. So the same for subducting slab. The slab for slab grain size goes more or less straight through, becomes broad here. Whereas if you have grain growth, as the slab goes through the transition zone into the lower mantle, the grain size is completely reset because you have a first order structural phase transition. So you start essentially from grain size. If you have centimeter grain sizes in the upper mantle, you start from scratch nucleating grains at that transition zone, right? So that's important. the exchange between upper and lower mantle involves that reset. And in general, grain growth in the upper mantle is fairly fast. We have millimeter to centimeter grain sizes, but it was known or hinted at that grain growth in the lower mantle is much slower than that. So the reset in the grain size for slabs becomes important because they deform quite differently than for constant grain size cases. So here the thousands of kilometers scale Earth's normal modes. And yeah, for those of you who haven't thought about it, it's quite interesting. After large earthquakes, right, you need a large earthquake magnitude 8 plus, then the whole Earth deforms, right? And so you have these different modes. One is a breathing mode, one is a football mode because the Earth becomes like football shaped or rugby ball shaped. And then, of course, you add, right, these nodes, right? So these are the resonant frequencies of the Earth. So you add nodes in the resonance and your number here increases. So this is just for reference, right? So these two numbers here account for how many nodes you have along the circumference of the Earth, as well as with respect to depth. So I'll touch on that, but it's not really that important. The higher number just means you have more of the nodes here at the surface of the Earth. So the two types of normal modes are the spheroidal mode, which measures essentially P wave or properties similar to P waves or SD motion. And then the second one, right, here's the picture, right? So slightly exaggerated. It's if you find GIFs of that. So this is one of the, so you have 4 nodes here, spheroidal, 0S4, and you can see exaggerated how the Earth changes its shape. Of course, I'll come back to that. The change here in height, very much exaggerated, right? That's measured in micron, or tens of microns, right? So the deformation, of course, is not something that you can feel, but you can measure it. Right, so this shape change is a little bit exaggerated here. And that's the second part is toroidal mode, and this is more analogous to Lavoie's and SH motion. So you have the two parts of the Earth actually shearing against each other. I'll talk mostly about the other type, the spheroidal modes. So one key aspect is the depth sensitivity. So here you have enumerated these different types of modes, and each of these, if you look at the resolution kernels where the this particular mode is most sensitive, you can see that, right? So here's the 660, that these modes sample the lower mantle. And that's why they're so interesting, because that's how we get information from the lower mantle. And the other part here, these modes all have different frequencies. So I won't go too much into the frequency dependence, but this paper was all about the frequency dependence, trying to reconcile the frequency dependence that we see in the Earth with the frequency dependence that we measure in the lab. So we use these different types of normal modes, and including one solid Earth type in this particular paper. So it gets more interesting or more complicated. You have to be able to model that, and that goes way beyond my mathematical capabilities. You start with what the seismologists call a snary Earth. So the Earth is assumed to be spherical, non-rotating, elastic, and isotropic. But then, of course, in order to make sense of your normal modes, your observed normal modes, you have to add the complications such as the Earth is rotating. And it's not spherical, it's not elastic, right? That's the inelastic part, which we measure in the lab. And it's also not isotropic, right? But the mathematical models of these modes become very involved, very complicated. One aspect is that these modes are split, right? And so the frequencies here, the modes are split into different parts, for example, due to Earth's rotation. But in that splitting, there's information that you can use to construct then something, as I'll come back to later, tomographic models of the interior of the Earth. So here's an example, the spectrum of normal modes from the Indian Ocean earthquake, right? That was a very large earthquake in 2004. And you can see, right, so again, the different types of modes indicated here, the football mode, this higher mode. Here's the breathing mode or the fundamental mode. And you can see that the frequency here in millihertz. You can see all these normal modes, but you can also see that they're split as if the Earth, as I said, was, a snary Earth, perfect, then you wouldn't see that split. But the fact that the Earth is split, and then you can look at the difference in frequencies, how large they're split here, that tells you something about the Earth. So that's as far as I will go into normal mode seismology. Now shifting the scale. So this is really where I come in, where my work comes in, experiments in particular at the micron scale. Right? So this was work done in collaboration. Shortly before I go into that, the experiments, a bit of background, right? So you have all seen soap bubbles, I assume. The pressure inside a soap bubble can be represented by that simple equation, right? So the pressure differential between inside and outside is that depends on the surface energy and then the radius of the soap bubble. And you can lower surface energy by increasing the radius. And that is the principle that drives, if you look at foam, you see that the bubbles in a foam increase in size as they mature. And that's very much the same driving mechanism for grain growth. So it's a reduction of the free energy of the system, expressed here by surface energy. So the less surface in the system, the lower the energy. That drives grain growth. And that's an important part because I showed earlier the picture of the rock, the xenolith. Grain boundaries are always present. And at high temperature, therefore, you always have grain growth. So you have continuous grain growth driven by that surface energy reduction. You can translate that into chemical potential and so on. So the grain growth law that has been first derived in material science, a lot of that comes from material sciences. So grain growth law, you have a mean grain size that then increases over time. And you can derive an equation like this. So grain growth squared, mean grain size squared as a function of time minus the initial grain size at some starting time is characterized by a growth constant and then time. Right? So as time ticks up, the mean grain size here increases. And if your starting grain size is small enough, because often you don't know your starting grain size very well, for mean grain size is large enough, you can just ignore that. And so the grain growth law becomes fairly simple. You have the mean grain size as a function of the growth constant, and then this exponent. So that looks fairly straightforward enough. What you have to add then, of course, this growth constant also includes things like temperature dependent, right? For the Earth, grain growth in the Earth, it's thermally activated. So you have an activation energy that goes into this grain growth constant. Experimentally, what you do is then determine that growth constant and that exponent. And once you have that, you can calculate grain size for any time. So it looks fairly straightforward, but of course, it's not quite that straightforward. So the earliest model that I showed on the previous slide assumed that you just had atom transport across the grain boundary. And for that particular model where you just take an atom from one grain on one side to the other side, you predict a growth exponent of 2. And as is often the case with these kind of simple models, people then proceeded experimentally to try to find systems where they have a grain growth exponent that is actually 2. And it turns out that's quite difficult. Most of the experimentally observed grain growth exponents are clustered around 3, but there is a whole range of grain growth exponents. Right? Grain growth exponents do vary from 2 to 4 or 5, and I'll show later much higher than that. So the interesting part is, right, this 2 was derived for the simple atom transport across the grain boundary, but growth, especially if you then have a polyphase material, it can't just be atom transport across the grain boundary because you have different crystals with different composition. So there has to be diffusion going on, which is part of the background. And even more sophisticated or later models of grain growth, it's more complicated. You have to look at mean fields, right? So each grain has a chemical potential which depends on its radius from the earlier equation. So you have to look at the mean field in which growth takes place. And so you come up with these kind of distributions in the mean field, right? So you have number of grains versus grain size. And for us experimentalists, another complication is that, so here time t1, you have a narrower distribution of grain sizes. The longer you run that, because from those grain growth models, you always have grains above a certain critical size that increase in size. Grains that are smaller decrease in size. So you develop this long tail towards small grain sizes. So your actual grain size distribution increases with mean grain size or with time, with growth time. So there are a few of these issues that, yes, complicate your modeling of grain growth behaviors. And then, of course, yeah, as I said, secondary phases, if you have melt or other things present, right, those are all factors that involve your grain growth rates. So in the end, you have to do experiments on each material to determine actually the growth exponent and then that, so the growth exponent n and the growth constant, right? That's especially the growth constant also includes, as I said, the activation energy, which is different for every material. The interesting part for the lower mantle is that the grain growth is a diffusive process. So from the grain growth experiments that I'll show, we have some idea now of activation energies in the lower mantle for diffusive processes. So the grain growth experiments going back, the pressure that we did these experiments at is 27 gigapascals, which translates to 27,000 times atmospheric pressure, right? So that's the key challenge in these experiments that, this is the development where you can go to lower mantle pressures with an apparatus that has a sufficient sample size so that you can actually do grain growth experiments without running into your capsule material. That's a relatively recent development, right? You have to keep these experiments not only at 27 gigapascals, but also at mantle temperatures, of course, because you want to know what the rates are at mantle temperatures. So that was the challenge, and this is what we did in the experimental sequence here. So this is the apparatus, as I said, at the Bayerische Scale Institute in Bayreuth in Germany. Here the apparatus, you can see that the lower part is actually sunk in the floor. The apparatus itself is about 2 stories tall, right? And that is the frame, right? Lots of steel here that contains that pressure that generates that confining pressure that you need to reach lower mantle pressures. And you can see the scale here better on the right, right? So this is the part here, right? She's looking into the part where the actual anvil assembly is, right? So this machine, there actually, to my knowledge, there are 3 of these. 2 of these are on a synchrotron, which doesn't do you any good for grain growth experiments because you don't monitor and you don't need to monitor them in situ. Plus, usually on the synchrotron, you get only, hours or a day or so. And we did lots of experiments that ranged up to a day in runtime. So we couldn't have done that study on a synchrotron. So this one is not on a synchrotron, and hence that's pretty much the only place where you can do these experiments at that pressure. So this is the guide block assembly, right? So this part here is essentially what is slid in here. You can see that that's where the guide block assembly goes. This is what contains your actual assembly here. And the advance with this particular multi-anvil apparatus was that you have this 45-degree sliding wedge geometry so that you create a near hydrostatic pressure on your sample, right? That's the key for grain growth. You want to have hydrostatic condition. You don't want to do a deformation experiment. So during deformation, you reduce the grain size because you put energy into the grain. Here, we wanted to look at just grain growth without deformation. And so that hydrostatic environment is key to conducting the experiments. And yeah, the cell assembly here, I'll show more pictures of that, sits in the center, it's compressed here. Oh, yeah, pressure calibration, there's all sorts of things that go into the background here. The pressure calibration is done by looking at known phase transitions, right? So you have all these materials here that have phase transitions in that pressure range, of course, up to, in this case, 40 gigapascals. So there's lots of background work before you can actually do these kinds of experiments. And here's the assembly, right? So these are tungsten carbide anvils here that have a truncated edge. And at that truncated edge sits the actual furnace assembly. And these are not standard tungsten carbide assembly. Right? That's the other part. Standard, even tungsten carbide is one of the hardest materials, short of diamond. These are special sauce Japanese tungsten carbide doped with cobalt and all sorts of other things that can sustain the pressure and the temperature, right? So the temperature on the inside here is up to 2,200 kelvins without flowing, right? Without deforming over the course of the experiment, which of course would change the pressure, right? So there's lots of actual material science going into designing and making this so that octahedron is magnesium oxide. The furnace itself here, I'll show that the furnace here for scale, right? That's a 5-cent euro coin. That's the furnace, right? The center of this goes to 2,200 K. These are interior parts of the furnace assembly, right? And here's the magnesium octahedron, right? So the interesting part is we measure temperature directly, right? This is also a challenge. We measure directly temperature in the center of the furnace assembly with the thermocouple wires. And of course, you can imagine, right, compression, and you have these very thin, these hair-thin thermocouple wires. The whole thing is assembled under the microscope, centered here. Like if something is not quite aligned, then you break the thermocouple wire and you don't know what your temperature is, right? So this is what it looks like after the experiment, after it's been at 27 GPa and 2,200 kelvins. So, right, here's a schematic of one assembly that we used. This on the outside, right? So this white here is that MgO, that octahedron. Here is the lanthanum chromate furnace and parts. That's so you conduct electricity, it's resistance heating. You conduct electricity through that. This is what it looks like after the experiment. The nice thing is, right, so this has been at 27 GPa, and I don't know, the sample at 2,000 Kelvin or something like that. The assembly actually looks fairly, it's not sheared, right? The sample capsules are square. So this is what we like to see, right? So we had near hydrostatic conditions maintained for, up to a day at that pressure and temperature. And this is a slightly different assembly. Here are the thermocouple wires, again, showing that we measure the temperature close to our samples, which is important for, constrained on the temperature. So experimental results. Olivine starting material, I'll come back to that. If you take olivine Mg2SiO4, bitumenite has a composition of MgSiO3. So you get a mix from the olivine starting material, you get a mix of that bitumenite, and then the extra Fe and Mg goes into what's called ferriperoxide. It's just iron magnesium oxide. And the brighter stuff here, that's the iron magnesium oxide. The darker is the bitumenite, the perovskite structure. And you can see that if you look at from 1.5 minutes, right, so you barely reach temperature and then quench, to 1,000 minutes, you can see that here's the grain size distribution, right? It's a nice normal grain size distribution. The mean grain size increases over time. So that's your normal grain growth. That looks very nice in these experiments. Then, of course, you have to do it as a function of temperature in order to get the activation energy for growth. And starting at 1,400 Kelvin up to 2,200 Kelvin, you could see, again, that coarsening here, right? The mean grain size increases over time. And so the starting grain or the grain size after at 1,400 Kelvin is only 0.3 micron, right? Up to then growth up to 1.7 micron. So if you then fit that as an Arrhenius relationship, right? So 1 over temperature, and here's the growth constant K, right? That determines your activation energy of 260 or so kilojoule per mole, which is interesting for lower mantle processes. In the upper mantle, activation energies are significantly higher. So that's one interesting difference. The behavior of the materials at that high pressure, you get lower activation energies. Not just in our study, but in others as well, in comparison to the upper mantle, right? So lower activation energy, less temperature sensitivity. So, and then a key part was that we also looked at phase proportions. So this is all 27 gigapascals. So all experiments are done at 27 gigapascals, 2,200 Kelvin, all done at a fixed time. But now we vary the starting material. So if you have orthopyroxene structurally or from the composition, orthopyroxene versus bitumenite silicate perovskite, that's a 1-to-1 relationship. It has the same chemical formula, just a different crystal structure. And so that gives you the coarsest grain size. I'm not sure whether you can see the grain boundaries here. That's fairly easy to see, right? That is at these temperatures, at these conditions, you have quite a large grain size. And then as you introduce more and more, essentially going towards olivine, right? So here's the experiments that I showed earlier from olivine, right? In comparison, this formula to this formula, right? You have excess magnesium and iron, so you form that ferropericlase, and that extra phase proportion. So here the distribution is you have 30% of that magnesium iron oxide. That slows down grain growth considerably. But the interesting thing is it doesn't happen in a linear way. Once you exceed sort of about 5% or so, then there isn't much difference anymore as you keep increasing your magnesium oxide proportion. So these are the three components, right? So this is shown here, ferropericlase on the horizontal axis versus grain size. You can see that nothing much happened until you get to about 5% or so and less of ferropericlase. And in the pure system from orthopyroxene, you have these relatively large grain sizes. And this is just, there was an earlier study done, pioneering studies, but there is always the worry that because all the materials have to undergo a phase transition and crystallize in the lower mantle crystal structure. So we use different kinds of starting materials to see whether there is an influence of the type of starting material that we use on the growth rate, because we suspected in the earlier study that was a problem. But it turns out that, so sol gel, that's a synthetic mix of oxides that has the right composition. Right? These are the ones that have high ferropericlase proportions, and then olivine and similar sol gel materials, and then a glass as a starting material, right? So you start without any kind of crystal structure and crystallize the perovskite. And then here the red from OPX. You can see that it doesn't matter. We always get the same growth kinetics. So that's very encouraging. That says that we're not seeing any transients or any problems from the initial crystallization from the crystallization of the bitumenite. Right. So we have putting that together, right? We have a time series, we have a temperature series, and we have growth rates as a function of second phase constants. So that's pretty comprehensive data set. That's a very nice data set. Those are lots of experiments, which mostly I didn't do. Mostly Hongjiang Fei actually did those in the end, the experiments. He was at the time a postdoc at the Geo Institute in Bayreuth. And he was very good. It's incredible. It took me a day or so to assemble one of these because you have to work under the microscope and thread basically the needle into these assemblies. And so he could have been a jeweler. He was very, very good with his hands. I'm sure lots of practice too. So summary of the experiments. So as I said, relatively fast single phase growth rate if you just have pure bitumenite. And much slower two-phase growth rates. And that's interesting, right? So going back to these growth exponents, as I said, from the models, you always try to link a particular growth exponent with some physical process, growth process that controls the growth. And we find that if we have pure OPX or pure bitumenite, then the growth exponent is roughly around 3. Whereas in the two-phase system, we have a growth exponent of 5.2. Right? So corresponding to the much slower growth rates in the two-phase system in comparison to the single-phase system. Right? And again, if you look at the exponent here, so the question is this one of the debates, right? So we have this more or less constant growth at high ferropericlase proportions, and then is it a jump from here or is it a continuous change? Not that it matters that much, right? So you have for the last 5%, your growth rates just slow down quite dramatically, right? No matter how you look at that. So these are the earlier experiments that I mentioned. These are pioneering experiments, first time that you could do these kind of experiment at lower mantle pressure. But you notice that 25 GPa, that's right at where the phase transition happens. And so that we get this very large growth exponent that, to my knowledge, hasn't been observed in any other system. And as a consequence, they predict very, very slow grain growth rates. But our thinking was that this had to do that they just were at the phase transition. And so they had this residual problem of nucleation, right? So a nucleation problem of the high pressure phase that then played into their growth exponent. So yeah, I think the data that we produced is actually very good, and I don't think it'll be repeated very soon, given all the experimental difficulties. So, of course, a day is nothing in comparison to the lifetime of the Earth. So that's where very large extrapolations happen based on the growth laws that we observe, right? So that's always the extrapolation is based on, we hope that we understand the process, that there's not something else that happens at very long time scale. So extrapolation, right? So what is noted here is pyrolytic and bitumenite enriched. Pyrolytic is essentially a model upper mantle composition that was in part put together here based on melting of peridotite to form basalt at mid-ocean ridges. So that's a pyrolytic composition that predicts that you have about 20% ferropericlase in your rock, right, in the lower mantle rock. And then this bitumenite enriched, right? So that's where you get to that 5%, right? Nearly pure bitumenite. And there varies, so this is where it becomes interesting, right? This is what we directly observe. Here you have to start making models and conjecture why you would have something that is that bitumenite enriched. And I won't, as I said, I won't go too much into geochemical arguments. I'll come back to that briefly. So pyrolytic upper mantle equivalent composition is 60% olivine, pyroxenes, and garnet, versus the bitumenite enriched, you just have 95 or more percent of just the orthopyroxene component. So the interesting part is for that pyrolytic composition where you have 20% ferropericlase, right? Here the curves, the different colors are different time scales. So here's the light blue 10, red 100, and then blue is the age of the Earth. So even after the age of the Earth, right, your grain size is a few hundred micron. So grain growth in the lower mantle is still really, really slow in comparison to the upper mantle, very slow. Except if you have really high bitumenite components, so if there's almost, or there's less than 5% ferropericlase, then growth increases substantially, and potentially you can reach millimeter to centimeter grain sizes, right? So that's the big difference, hundreds of microns versus millimeter to centimeter. And that then has consequences, just jumping to the viscosity. You potentially transition from what is called diffusion creep, so mediated by diffusion along grain boundaries, just like the grain growth experiments. So that is a very good application of that, to something that's called dislocation creep, where you have grain internal defects. And that depends then on the stress that you think is at the lower mantle, so probably more like the lower stresses here, but potentially, right, so this gives you an increase in the viscosity here to much higher viscosities for those bitumenite enriched systems, right? So yeah, diffusion creep, you have cubic grain size dependence, and viscosity depends on which mechanism and what the grain size of that is, right? So that's heading towards application of our results, right? So briefly, application, again, the lower mantle has that degree 2 heterogeneity. Here, a different view that already indicates maybe the lower mantle is a little bit more complicated than that, because what's plotted on top here, the dots are inferred or observed mantle plumes. So somewhere here in the Pacific, right, you have Hawaii, and then you have all sorts of plumes all over, depending how you count. You have these plumes that supposedly originate from the lower mantle based on their geochemical composition, right? So you see the dominant degree 2 structure, but a lot more complication as you get to higher resolution in your seismic images. And another interesting part is that, so this is a profile across Yellowstone, which is inferred to be a plume. You can see that, right? So 2,500 kilometers depth. You can see that somewhere at 1,000 kilometer, this plume doesn't rise straight up anymore, but it becomes bent. It becomes shear somehow, right? So this, without going into too much details, the inference is that you have something happening at 1,000 kilometers depth, some change at 1,000 kilometers depth. Remember, the phase transition is at 660, right? So that's a known phase transition. There's no argument about that. At 1,000 kilometers is much more difficult. What is happening at 1,000 kilometers? There's no known phase transition. Right? It's just lower mantle. So this leads to all sorts of models and speculation, right, from Dietmar Müller, New South Wales, ascending plumes, right? So something happens here at that dashed line at 1,000 kilometers depth, and you partly have decoupled convection in the upper mantle, or at least in the upper 1,000 kilometers or so, and then a difference in convection in the lower mantle. And you start looking at these ascending plumes, right? They get chemically very heterogeneous, right? Trying to explain isotope ratios in hotspots and so on, right? So that you entrain ambient mantle, you have these ultra low velocity zones, which are not entirely clear what exactly they are. And then you have zoned parts, probably, I'll show another one. These things are recycled oceanic crust. So there's all sorts of things going on here. And yeah, another model here, this beams, these are then inferred to be Bridgmanite enriched zones, which becomes important if you think about grain growth, right? If these are Bridgmanite enriched zones, they will have much larger grain size, so they'll have larger viscosity in comparison to the surrounding mantle, right? This is what our grain growth results aim at. In the end, you're trying to explain, yeah, I'll briefly, there's another indication, right? So magnesium to silicon is 1, right? That's Bridgmanite enriched. Magnesium to silicon 1.2. Seismological observations, at least according to some authors, point in the direction that you should have this Bridgmanite enriched lower mantle, right? So the lower mantle, is inferred to be dominated by these Bridgmanite enriched zones. And there's lots of speculations, right? The interesting part is that these could be leftovers from crystallization of the magma ocean. So they could contain potentially a very early history of the Earth, right? So that's where the geochemists come in. So in other words, at 1,000 kilometers, the inference is that you transition from something that looks more like the upper mantle compositionally to something that is much more Bridgmanite enriched, right? So that has a ratio of magnesium to silicon of 1 instead of that 1.2, closer to an olivine composition here, closer to an OPX composition. So, and that leads then to this model that if you look at the grain size, right, here you have essentially fine-grained upper mantle-like material with 20% ferropericlase or so. You have slow growth rates versus then in the rest of the lower mantle, you're less than 5% ferropericlase. And so you have much coarser grain sizes, much larger grain sizes, and therefore you get this systematic increase in viscosity at about 1,000 kilometers depth. And those 1,000 kilometers, yeah, there is nothing, as I said, there's no phase transition. That is mostly sort of observational from seismic images that I showed earlier, that at that depth, ascending plumes and some slabs seem to show deviation from going straight down. So that's the justification that in that depth range, yeah, a jump, it's not really a jump in that sense, but because it's not a phase transition, but that you have a depth range where the viscosity increases. And from our experiments, we say that that's due to the grain size increase because you almost have pure Bridgmanite in the lower part of the upper mantle. So that's certainly somewhat speculative, building on other observations and so on. But as I said, the underlying experiments are really, really good. So there's another, to finish up here, there's another part. If you look at normal mode tomography, if you look at the upper mantle, right? So this here is the upper mantle. So you have normal modes, right? Again, these sensitivity kernels as a function of depth. So the transition zone here, core mantle boundary, right? These normal modes have their sensitivity in the upper mantle. If you look at the structure and elastic observation, that means it's just shear velocity, right? So you're looking at the shear modulus. You can see that mid-ocean ridges have low shear velocities. I guess I should have copied the range here. So these are low shear velocities. And then where you have subduction zones, you have high, and cratons and so on, you have high shear velocities. Keeping in mind, right, this is a very coarse image of the upper mantle because you're using modes which have, the depth resolution is one aspect, but the horizontal resolution is thousands of kilometers. So we're not trying to resolve upper mantle structure with that. The point here is to show that where we have low velocities, we have also high attenuation. So low velocities equate to lossy rocks in the upper mantle. And that, of course, corresponds very nicely with our experiments here. So this is part of Hitan's PhD. You measure shear modulus as a function of oscillation period, and then as a function of temperature. So if you look at, so the lowest temperature, the highest temperatures here, 1300 degrees C, you can see that the shear modulus decreases at fixed temperature with increasing oscillation period. So that's the frequency dependence that I mentioned earlier. That's something that on the seismic range becomes much harder to constrain than in our experiments, where we measure over 3 decades, so from 1 second to 1,000 seconds. And that decrease in the shear modulus goes along with an increase of dissipation or attenuation, so energy loss per cycle. Right? So as temperature increases, the materials become more and more lossy. And that corresponds very nicely. What you see here, you have low velocities here, right, corresponding to low shear moduli, and those are the regions that have high attenuation or high dissipation, right? So here in the upper mantle, everything works. You have that nice correlation, and that's, of course, a lot of the work that we're doing is trying to figure out temperature and frequency dependence and so on. So you go to the lower mantle, and things become different. So here again, the upper mantle, the correspondence of low velocity and high attenuation. If you go to the lower mantle, again, elastic observations, that's shear velocity, shear modulus, you have that degree 2 heterogeneity, all good. The problem is that that corresponds to low attenuation. So the areas that have the lowest velocities also are the least lossy. And if you look at the relationship here, the experimental relationship between temperature and loss, right? So as temperature increases, the rocks become more lossy. So that was the conundrum that was difficult to explain, why you would have this anti-correlation, whereas in this, as I said, is really to show that in the upper mantle, the normal modes work as you expected, but in the lower mantle, something is different. And this is again where the grain growth experiments are in the background. So this diagram is a little difficult to understand what's actually going on. So what is plotted here is again dissipation or attenuation, 1 over Q on the vertical, and shear velocity on the horizontal. So there's 2 variables in here, right? So from our experiments, we know that we have a grain size dependence of the modulus and also the attenuation. The more fine-grained the material, the more lossy it is. Again, the importance of grain boundaries, just like for grain growth, right? The more grain boundaries you have, the more loss you have in your rock. So what's shown here in these diagrams is a grain size increase and a temperature increase, right? And they're almost perpendicular to each other, at least in a certain region here. So in the upper mantle, then these gray dots are the data from the normal modes. As I said, that's very smeared out. The upper mantle, as we know, is very heterogeneous. So with the normal mode, you're not going to resolve fine structure. So it's all kind of averaged. But you can see that if you look at the data trend, it more or less follows temperature, right? So in the upper mantle, temperature controls velocity variations and variations of attenuation to first order. There's other processes if you look at more details in the upper mantle, but to first order, it's a temperature trend. Obviously, that doesn't work for the lower mantle. You can see the data cloud here for the lower mantle is basically perpendicular to the temperature trend. So what we infer then is happening that instead of a variation in temperature, as you see in the upper mantle, what controls velocities and attenuation in the lower mantle is variation in grain size. And the idea is that if you have a slab, which is cold, but it undergoes the phase transition, and therefore, because it's cold, grain growth, as we saw, is very slow. So at that very slow grain growth, you have slabs are very fine-grained. They have high attenuation, but because they're cold, they have high velocities. Right? So that attempts to reconcile versus the Bridgmanite enriched zones from other arguments, geochemical and so on, at the low shear velocity point towards the fact that they're hot. But because they're Bridgmanite enriched, they have fast grain growth. So they have high grain, large grain sizes. So the idea is that we explain this anti-correlation in comparison to the upper mantle with just grain growth kinetics and large temperature differences between the slabs, which have to heat up gradually, right? Heat diffusion is slow, so they heat up gradually, and grain growth is even slower. So these are fast but high attenuating, and the Bridgmanite enriched zones, which may have been there since the birth of the Earth, very coarse grained, are hot because they are resident in the lower mantle for long periods of time, and they're coarse grained because they almost contain no periclase. So perhaps this last slide here summarizing this is a little bit easier to understand, right? So you have subducting slabs, which are fine-grained. The structure of the lower mantle, I won't go into any of the details here, but you have slabs that then sit at the core mantle boundary and slowly heat up. But these are fine-grained versus these large, low shear velocity provinces conjectured to be residues from a crystallizing magma ocean are very coarse-grained, but they're hot because they have been sitting on the core mantle boundary for long periods of time. And then, of course, this somehow here at the edges of these LLSVPs, that's where you have rising plumes. So the bottom line is that, yes, if you don't know much about the lower mantle, right, it's easy to say it's kind of boring, nothing much going on. And the more technology advances, both experimentally in the lab with the grain growth experiments, but also seismically, you get much higher resolution, the more interesting these regions become. So that's it from my part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uli. That was very thought-provoking. Okay, so we have any questions for Uli?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, when there is a change in the grain size from the coarser grain to the finer grain, is there a change in mechanism also from diffusion to dislocations?
That is another good question, right? So there's lots of parts of the upper mantle, of the lower mantle that I didn't go into. One aspect why people argue for diffusion creep in the lower mantle is that there is virtually no seismic anisotropy. Right? In the upper mantle, you have seismic anisotropy. Seismic anisotropy is coupled to dislocation creep as deformation mechanism. The absence of seismic anisotropy is taken as indication that you don't have dislocation creep in the lower mantle, right? So, but yeah, the question is, and maybe seismologists will be able to answer that better, are we in a position to observe seismic anisotropy? Do we have the resolution, right? The normal modes I don't think have the resolution to, if you have a small degree of anisotropy suggesting dislocation creep, that you'd see that, right? So there's that question whether we just haven't been able to observe it yet, or there are different types of dislocation creep. Without going into too much detail, there is a type of dislocation creep by just climb of dislocation that also doesn't give you anisotropy. So does that answer your question? So the idea is still that the lower mantle deforms by diffusion creep. But as I showed, potentially in these coarse-grained regions, you have that transition to dislocation creep.
Do you want me to comment on this?
Yeah, of course.
It's pretty well constrained. I would say that the bulk of the lower mantle is isotropic. But with time, there's more and more suggestions that the uppermost, the transition zone and the uppermost part of the lower mantle, there could be some anisotropy, particularly around subducting slabs. And then, of course, the very bottom, the D double prime, just above the core, is a known layer of anisotropy. I would argue that we know that the bulk of the lower mantle is isotropic.
Okay.
Large. At least it's certainly not comparable to the upper mantle.
Right.
Much reduced.
Yeah. But the lower part, again, there's lots of interesting stuff. That D double prime region, that's contentious anyway. There could be another phase transition that could be in these ultra low velocity zones, could be melt. So the region that sits above 100 kilometers or so off the core, that's sort of exempted from all of this. It's more complicated.
At the back, Saman.
Yeah.
Like in mostly geodynamics modeling, we use a Newtonian viscosity or reality. So
Newtonian, yes. So that would be diffusion creep.
yeah. So, I would like about your opinion, like it will help to include the grain size dependent reality, right?
You would,
Like in that case, we use like some specific viscosity maybe. So like it will help to be grain dependent
yeah, I mean,
reality like primordial.
yes, I would argue yes, because diffusion creep depends cubic on grain size, right? The grain size is an important parameter for the viscosity, right? So yes, that's what I was trying to show earlier with these models that we ran way back, that there's quite a difference if you include grain growth in the simulations, right? To make them self-consistent, as you have convection in the upper and lower mantle, include some grain growth parameterization. Because that makes them a huge difference, especially for slabs, right? Because the grain size is reset and grain growth is very slow. So yes, I would argue. I mean, the rheology is linear in diffusion creep, but it's cubic dependence on grain size.
Mark.
I was wondering, how did your growth rates end up comparing to the Danberg models that you motivated with?
So the Danberg models, we just took, I think that there are two. One is slower grain growth. That was, I think, the Yamazaki parameters that we used. And then at that time, I already figured that those grain growth rates are probably not quite realistic. So we put in a faster grain growth rates. I haven't looked back at what parameters we exactly took to model the faster grain growth. But I would think that, those faster grain growth rates sort of correspond to the 20% ferropericlase bitumenite mixture and those kind of rates. So the faster grain growth rates, which we then saw experimentally.
And can I just ask about the experiments, which look really cool, frankly, and well done on getting to that point. You talk about extrapolation, which is always problems in these kind of experiments. What do you see as the main weaknesses? What are the big extrapolations? I guess grain size is obvious.
One intriguing aspect, and I don't know, I have that. Yeah. So here on these diagrams, you have, right. So this pink dashed line here is the viscosity from geoid modeling, right? And there are other things like that suggest that, right? So you can see that here's a slope, right? The viscosity increases systematically with depth. And that is due, you not only have an activation energy, you also have an activation volume. But constraining the activation volume is really difficult. Even for the upper mantle, the activation volume is not very well constrained for all sorts of processes. Even less so for the lower mantle. We have experiments where we try to do grain growth at different pressures, but there the pressure calibration, of course, has a very large influence, so they aren't published yet. But it's intriguing to see that if, the geoid modeling has its own, you might know better than I do, but its own, problems. But there are suggestions that there isn't a systematic increase of the viscosity with depth. So that raises the question about the activation volume. So that's one aspect that, is not very well constrained yet. Experimentally, I mean, this is as good as it gets at the fixed pressure and range of temperatures and so on. So I think these experiments are good, but you do have to extrapolate them. If you had dislocation creep, then you have a grain size reduction mechanism, right? But as we just heard, most likely in the bulk of the lower mantle, you have no anisotropy, no dislocation creep. So that's, yeah.
Any final questions? No? In which case, let's thank Uli once again. So we have some free tea and cake outside, so do stick around and enjoy that. Tonight we'll be having a dinner. I'll be going for dinner at 6 p.m. at Amici in the city. Thank you for people who contacted me. We probably have space for one more person if there's any last minute interest. Do let me know in the next hour because we'll be booking the table. And lastly, Uli is still around this afternoon and tomorrow morning if anyone would like to talk further about
happy to answer questions.
anything. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.